With $847 in her checking account and her daughter's asthma medication running dangerously low, Zara Williams is cleaning the penthouse suite of Seoul's most exclusive hotel when she comes face to face with Korea's most feared crime lord. One slap changes everything, but not in the way either of them expected. At 26, Zara balanced impossible mathematics every single day. Rent was 850,000 won due in 5 days. Mia's inhaler prescription cost 120,000 won and couldn't wait. The double shifts at the Grand Millennium Hotel paid just enough to survive, but never enough to breathe. She moved through the luxury suites like a ghost, invisible to the wealthy guests who treated five-star amenities as basic necessities while she calculated whether she could afford both groceries and laundry soap this week. Her natural hair was pulled back in neat braids that stayed perfect through 12-hour shifts, and her warm brown eyes held the kind of tired determination that came from loving someone more than yourself. At 5 feet 6 inches with graceful movements that came from years of efficient work, she carried herself with quiet dignity even when exhaustion weighed down her shoulders. Mia was everything. Her 4-year-old daughter's laugh, her questions about why they lived in a one-room apartment while Mama cleaned palaces, her trust that everything would be okay because Mama always made it okay. The penthouse on the 42nd floor was Zara's last stop of the day, typically vacant during afternoon hours when business executives attended meetings across the city. She used her master key and slipped inside, immediately struck by the familiar scent of expensive cologne and leather that seemed to permeate every surface. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of Seoul that cost more per night than she made in 3 months. Italian marble, custom furniture, original artwork that probably cost more than her annual salary. She was replacing towels in the master bathroom when she heard the front door open. Voices carried down the hall, speaking rapid Korean in tones that made her freeze. Male voices. Multiple men. And they weren't supposed to be here. Zara checked her watch. 3:15. The suite was reserved for evening occupancy. She grabbed her cleaning cart and headed for the service entrance, hoping to slip out unnoticed. Hotel policy was clear. Cleaning staff avoided guests whenever possible, maintaining the illusion that luxury happened by magic rather than minimum wage labor. She almost made it. A man appeared in the hallway, blocking her path to escape. He was Korean, late 30s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than her rent. But it wasn't the expensive clothes that made her stomach clench with fear. It was the way he carried himself, the controlled intensity that radiated from every movement, the dark eyes that missed nothing and showed no warmth whatsoever. Behind him, 2 other men emerged from what she assumed was a business meeting. All 3 wore the same uniform of wealth and danger, but this man commanded their attention with subtle gestures that spoke of absolute authority. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his English accented but perfect. "Cleaning, sir. I didn't know the suite was occupied. I'll leave immediately." His eyes narrowed as they tracked from her cleaning cart to her hotel uniform to her face. Something in his expression shifted, becoming calculating and cold. "Cleaning." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the expensive watch on his wrist, smell the subtle cologne that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. "We're listening, reporting, taking pictures." The accusation hit her like a physical blow. "Sir, I'm housekeeping staff. I have identification." She reached for her hotel badge, but his hand shot out, gripping her wrist with controlled strength that made her breath catch. "People like you always have identification. The question is who you're really working for." The casual dismissal in his voice, the assumption that she was some kind of spy or criminal, the way he said people like you as if her existence was inherently suspicious, ignited something in Zara that overcame every survival instinct. "People like me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear hammering against her ribs. "You mean people who work for a living? People who don't assume the worst of strangers? People who know the difference between paranoia and common sense?" His grip tightened, not enough to hurt, but enough to remind her who held the power in this exchange. "I mean people who show up where they don't belong, asking questions, taking mental notes about security systems and private conversations." That's when something inside Zara snapped. She thought of Mia waiting at daycare, of the bills piling up, of every humiliation she'd swallowed to keep them both fed and housed. She thought of working double shifts while men like this threw around accusations based on nothing but prejudice and arrogance. Her free hand moved before her brain could stop it, connecting with his cheek in a sharp crack that echoed through the marble-floored hallway. The silence that followed was absolute. The two men behind him reached inside their jackets, hands moving toward what she suddenly realized were weapons. But the man she'd slapped held up one finger, stopping them with a gesture that spoke of absolute command. Instead of the rage she expected, he smiled. Not a warm smile, not even an amused smile, but something far more dangerous. He stepped closer, his hand moving from her wrist to her chin, tilting her face up to meet his gaze. Now that, he said quietly, was honest. He studied her face with the same intensity he might examine a business contract, taking in her wide eyes, the fear she couldn't quite hide, the stubborn tilt of her chin that said she regretted nothing. What's your name? Zara Williams. How long have you worked here, Zara Williams? 2 years. Children. The question was so unexpected she answered before thinking. 1. A daughter. Something shifted in his expression, becoming less predatory and more curious. And you're here because you need the money, not because anyone sent you to spy on my meetings. It wasn't really a question, but she answered anyway. Yes. He released her chin but didn't step back, studying her with dark eyes that seemed to see everything. My name is Park Jae-sung. These are my associates, Kim and Lee. We were discussing business that requires privacy, which is why your presence was concerning. The formal introduction felt surreal after she'd just slapped him, but she recognized it as some kind of test or evaluation. I understand, Mr. Park. I apologize for the misunderstanding. If you'll excuse me, I'll finish my shift on other floors. She moved toward her cleaning cart, but his voice stopped her. Miss Williams. She turned back, expecting to be fired or worse. That medication your daughter needs. How much does it cost? The question was so personal, so impossible, that she stared at him without answering. The inhaler, he clarified. Asthma medication is expensive, especially for single mothers working housekeeping jobs. How could he possibly know that? Zara wondered, then realized that men like Park Jae-sung probably knew everything about everyone in their vicinity within minutes of meeting them. It's handled, she said quietly. Is it? The two words carried weight that made her throat tighten. Because it wasn't handled. She was 3 days away from Mia running out of medication and at least a week away from affording the refill. Thank you for your concern, Mr. Park, but my personal situation isn't your responsibility. He smiled again, that same dangerous expression that suggested he found her defiance entertaining rather than offensive. Perhaps not. But women who slap men like me are rare, Miss Williams. That kind of courage usually comes from protecting something precious. He reached into his jacket and she tensed, but he withdrew only a business card, elegant black paper with silver lettering. When you realize that courage deserves better than cleaning hotel rooms, call me. She took the card automatically, feeling the expensive paper between her fingers. I don't understand. You will. He gestured to his associates, who moved toward the elevator with the fluid coordination of men accustomed to following orders without question. Finish your shift, Miss Williams. But think about what happens when the medication runs out again next month. And the month after that. The elevator doors closed behind them, leaving her alone in the hallway with her cart, her confusion, and a business card that felt like it weighed 10 pounds. She looked down at the card. Park Jae-sung. No title, no company name, just a phone number printed in elegant silver script. She should throw it away. This stranger, this dangerous man who radiated power and commanded armed associates, getting involved with him would be insane. But she slipped the card into her uniform pocket anyway, her fingers tracing the edge of the expensive paper. Because he was right about the medication, and the rent, and the impossible mathematics that got harder every month no matter how many double shifts she worked. She finished cleaning the penthouse with mechanical efficiency, her mind replaying every word of the encounter. The way he'd smiled after she slapped him, the casual knowledge of her situation, the suggestion that her courage deserved better. 3 hours later, walking through Seoul's evening streets toward the daycare where Mia waited with her bright smile and endless questions, Zara Williams carried a business card that felt like a door to a world she didn't understand but might desperately need. Zara expected to be fired the moment she reported for her next shift. Instead, She found herself summoned to the executive floor with an offer that would change everything. But nothing came without a price in Park Jae-sung's world. The next morning arrived with the gray promise of another impossible day. Zara, dressed in her hotel uniform, braided her hair with practiced efficiency, and kissed Mia goodbye at the daycare that cost more than she could afford, but less than she feared. Her daughter's inhaler sat on the kitchen counter like a ticking clock, 3 doses remaining before the mathematics of survival became even more desperate. She'd barely slept, turning Park Jae-sung's business card over in her fingers until the expensive paper became soft with handling. The man's dark eyes haunted her dreams, along with his casual knowledge of her situation and the dangerous smile he'd worn after she'd slapped him. Men like that didn't forgive disrespect. They collected debts with interest. At the Grand Millennium Hotel, she checked in with her supervisor, expecting the termination conversation that would end her employment and eliminate her last steady income. Instead, Mrs. Chun handed her a single assignment sheet with an address she didn't recognize. Executive floor, Mrs. Chun said, her expression carefully neutral. Private office. They requested you specifically. The executive floor existed in a different universe from the guest rooms Zara normally cleaned. Here, marble gave way to dark wood, crystal chandeliers cast warm light instead of efficient fluorescence, and the very air seemed to cost more per breath. She stood before double doors marked only with a discrete number, her cleaning cart feeling absurd in the elegant hallway. She knocked softly. Enter. Park Jae-sung sat behind a desk that could have served as a landing strip, his expensive suit perfectly pressed despite the early hour. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided a view of Seoul that made her feel like she was flying, and she realized this wasn't a hotel office, but something far more permanent. Original artwork covered the walls, and the scent of leather and expensive cologne permeated every surface. Good morning, Miss Williams. Please sit. He gestured to a chair positioned precisely across from his desk, upholstered in buttery leather that probably cost more than her monthly salary. She remained standing, her hands gripping the handle of her cart. I'm here to work, Mr. Park. Actually, you're here to listen. Sit. The command in his voice wasn't harsh, but it brooked no argument. She sat, feeling the expensive leather conform to her body in ways that made her acutely aware of the class differential between them. Over the past 18 hours, I've learned quite a bit about you, Zara Williams. Single mother, divorced 3 years ago from a man named Marcus Williams who accumulated significant gambling debts before disappearing entirely. You work 60 hours per week between this hotel and weekend catering jobs. Your daughter Mia has asthma and requires daily medication that costs more than many people's rent. You've been late on rent 4 times this year, but never missed a payment completely. Your credit score is excellent despite your circumstances, and your employment record shows perfect attendance and 0 complaints. Each fact landed like a physical blow. The casual invasion of privacy, the thorough investigation, the reduction of her struggle to a business profile. Why? She asked, her voice barely steady. Because women who slap dangerous men are rare, Miss Williams. That kind of fire usually burns for a reason, and I needed to understand what yours was. He opened a leather folder and withdrew several documents, arranging them with precise movements. Your reason is your daughter. Everything you do, every sacrifice you make, every humiliation you endure, it's all for her. That kind of devotion is exactly what I need. I don't understand. My mother is 81 years old. She's been widowed for 5 years and speaks very little English. Since my father's death, she's become increasingly isolated, spending her days in a house that's more fortress than home. She needs companionship, someone genuine who can provide care and conversation. Not another employee who sees her as a job, but someone who understands what it means to protect family. The pieces began forming a picture she didn't like. A business proposition wrapped in personal revelation. You want me to be your mother's caretaker. I want you to be her companion. To live in our family compound. To ensure she's never alone. To help her navigate a world where she feels increasingly lost. In exchange, I'm offering you $200,000 per year, full medical insurance for both you and Mia, housing in a separate wing of our estate, and private school tuition for your daughter. The numbers hit her like vertigo. $200,000 was more than she made in 5 years of double shifts and weekend jobs. Medical insurance meant Mia's medication would never again be a choice between breathing and eating. Private school meant opportunities Zara had only dreamed of providing. Why would you pay so much for a companion? Because my mother has been approached by dozens of qualified candidates over the years. Nurses, companions, caregivers with impressive credentials and perfect references. She's dismissed every one within a week. Do you know what she told me about them? Zara shook her head. She said they smiled with their mouths, but not with their eyes. They were polite, but never genuine. They saw an old Korean woman with money instead of a person with stories and wisdom and a heart that's been broken by loss. He stood and moved to the window, his silhouette sharp against the Seoul skyline. Yesterday, when you defended yourself against my accusations, you weren't calculating the response that would serve you best. You reacted with honest anger to honest injustice. That's exactly the kind of authenticity my mother needs. And what do you get out of this arrangement, Mr. Park? Peace of mind. The knowledge that my mother is cared for by someone who won't see her as a burden or an inconvenience. Someone who understands what it means to love family more than yourself. His explanation sounded reasonable, even generous, but Zara had learned that generous offers always came with hidden costs. What aren't you telling me? He turned from the window, his dark eyes studying her face with that same intensity she'd encountered in the penthouse hallway. I'm telling you that accepting this position means entering my world, Miss Williams. My family, my home, my protection, but also my rules and my dangers. There are people who would use my mother's happiness against me, who would target anyone close to our family to gain leverage. By accepting my offer, you and your daughter become part of something larger and more complicated than hotel employment. So you're offering me money in exchange for putting my daughter in danger. I'm offering you security in exchange for accepting that danger already exists in your current life. How safe is Mia when you're working 16-hour days and can't afford her medication? How protected is she in a neighborhood where you lock 3 deadbolts and still worry every time you leave for work? The truth of his words hit harder than she wanted to admit. Safety was an illusion when you lived paycheck to paycheck, when one missed shift could mean eviction and one emergency could destroy everything you'd built. There would be conditions, she said. Of course. I want to meet your mother first. If she doesn't like me, if we don't connect naturally, the deal is off regardless of what you're offering. Agreed. I want everything in writing. Salary, benefits, job description, termination clauses, everything clearly defined so there are no misunderstandings later. Naturally. And I want to understand exactly what entering your world means, Mr. Park. I'm not naive enough to believe you made your fortune in legitimate business, but I need to know what I'm exposing my daughter to. He smiled, the same dangerous expression that had followed her slap the day before. I appreciate directness, Miss Williams. Yes, my business interests extend beyond what most people would consider legitimate. I control significant territory in Seoul through methods that aren't always legal. But I also employ over 300 people, contribute to orphanages and schools, and ensure that my neighborhood is safer than most places in this city. My mother knows what I am and accepts it because she understands that power used correctly protects rather than destroys. And if I say yes to this arrangement, my daughter and I become part of what you protect. You become family, Miss Williams. Which means anyone who threatens you answers to me personally. The weight of that statement settled over her like armor and chains simultaneously. Protection from a man like Park Jae-sung would be absolute, but it would also be permanent. She looked down at the contracts spread across his desk, each page representing a life she'd never imagined for herself or Mia. $200,000. Medical insurance. Private school. Safety. She thought about the inhaler on her kitchen counter, about the late rent notices, about explaining to Mia why they couldn't afford the toys other children took for granted. I need time to think. Of course. 24 hours. The deadline wasn't negotiable, but it was fair. Life-changing decisions deserved careful consideration, even when the alternative was slow starvation disguised as independence. One more question, Mr. Park. Yes. Why did you smile when I slapped you? He leaned back in his chair, studying her with something that might have been respect. Because in my world, Miss Williams, people either fear me or want something from me. You were the first person in years to treat me like an ordinary man who'd said something offensive. It was refreshingly honest. She stood, smoothing down her uniform skirt, and moved toward the door. I'll give you an answer tomorrow. Zara Williams, he called as she reached for the handle. Yes, your daughter's medication. There's a pharmacy account established in your name at Seoul Medical Center. The prescription will be filled and ready for pickup this afternoon." She turned back, staring at him across the expensive office. "I haven't said yes yet." "No," he agreed. "But your daughter needs to breathe while you decide." The gesture was simultaneously kind and manipulative, generous and controlling, and she realized it perfectly summarized the choice he was offering her. Security that came with strings, protection that demanded surrender, salvation that required trust in a man whose world operated by rules she didn't understand. She left the office with his business proposal burning in her mind and his unexpected mercy warming her heart, already knowing what her answer would be, but needing the full 24 hours to convince herself she was making a choice rather than accepting the inevitable. 24 hours later, Zara Williams signed her name to contracts that transformed her from a struggling single mother into the live-in companion for one of Seoul's most powerful families. But entering Park Jae-sung's world meant discovering that luxury and danger were often indistinguishable. The Park family compound sprawled across 10 acres in Seoul's most exclusive district, hidden behind walls that looked decorative but felt fortress-like. As their black sedan approached the main gates, Zara held Mia's small hand and watched armed guards check identification with the practiced efficiency of soldiers. The driver, introduced only as Mr. Kim, navigated through manicured gardens where traditional Korean pavilions sat alongside contemporary sculptures, creating a landscape that honored the past while embracing modern wealth. The main house rose before them like something from a Korean drama, all clean lines and expensive materials, with floor-to-ceiling windows that reflected the afternoon sun. But it was the smaller details that spoke of real power. The discreet security cameras, the guards dressed as gardeners, the sense that everything beautiful was also carefully controlled. "Mama, is this where we're going to live?" Mia whispered, her 4-year-old voice filled with the kind of wonder that made Zara's heart ache. "Part of it, sweetheart. We're going to take care of a very nice grandmother who needs company." The family quarters occupied an entire wing of the main house, connected by covered walkways to a separate residence that would be their new home. As they toured their apartment, Zara struggled to process the reality of marble countertops, heated floors, and a bathroom larger than their old entire living space. Mia ran from room to room, delighting in the discovery of her own bedroom with built-in bookshelves and a window seat that overlooked the gardens. But it was the meeting with Grandmother Park that would determine whether this fairy tale arrangement could become real family connection or would remain an elegant form of well-paid imprisonment. Mrs. Park Uni sat in the main house's formal living room, dressed in a silk hanbok that probably cost more than Zara's previous monthly salary. At 81, she carried herself with the kind of dignity that came from decades of commanding respect, her silver hair styled in an elegant chignon, her dark eyes sharp with intelligence and wariness. She studied Zara with the same intensity her son had shown, but where Park Jae-sung's gaze felt calculating, his mother's felt evaluative in a more personal way. She spoke in careful English, each word precisely formed. "You are the young woman who slapped my son." "Yes, ma'am. I apologize if that troubles you." Mrs. Park's expression remained neutral as she shifted her attention to Mia, who had been coached to bow respectfully, but was currently staring in fascination at the elderly woman's beautiful clothing. "And this is your daughter. This is Mia. Say hello, sweetheart." "Hello, Mrs. Park," Mia said with the careful pronunciation Zara had practiced with her during the drive. Something softened in the elderly woman's face as she leaned forward slightly. "Hello, little one. Do you know why you're here?" Mia looked to her mother for permission, then answered with 4-year-old honesty. "Mama says you're lonely and need friends. I know about being lonely sometimes." The simple statement hung in the air like a bridge between two vastly different worlds, and Zara watched Mrs. Park's formal composure crack just slightly. Over the following days, Zara discovered that caring for Mrs. Park required patience, cultural sensitivity, and genuine affection rather than medical expertise. The elderly woman's physical health was excellent for her age, but her emotional isolation had become profound since her husband's death. She spent hours sitting by windows, looking out at gardens she rarely visited, surrounded by staff who attended to her needs, but never truly engaged with her thoughts or memories. Zara's approach was different. Instead of managing Mrs. Park's schedule, she joined it. She sat beside the elderly woman during her morning tea, asking about the photographs that covered every surface and listening to stories about a younger soul, about raising children in a world where power was earned through sacrifice and vigilance. She helped Mrs. Park tend to her orchid collection, learning the Korean names for different varieties and sharing stories about the herb garden her own grandmother had maintained in Atlanta. The language barrier became a bridge rather than a wall. Mrs. Park taught Zara basic Korean phrases, while Zara helped the elderly woman practice English conversation that went beyond polite formalities. They found a rhythm in their daily routines. Morning tea with discussion of family photographs. Afternoon walks through the gardens with Mia running ahead to collect interesting leaves. Evening meals where Mrs. Park told traditional stories that Mia absorbed with rapt attention despite understanding only half the words. Mia's presence transformed the household in ways Zara hadn't anticipated. The little girl's natural curiosity and innocent questions brought laughter back to rooms that had been too quiet for too long. She called Mrs. Park Halabiji Park, after being gently corrected about the proper term for grandmother, and the elderly woman's face would light up whenever Mia appeared with new drawings or questions about Korean customs. The child's health flourished in ways that went beyond having reliable access to medication. The estate's clean air helped her breathing. The stress-free environment eliminated the anxiety that had often triggered her asthma attacks, and the private tutors Park Jae-sung arranged prepared her for enrollment at Seoul International Academy, one of the city's most prestigious schools. For 3 months, their new life settled into rhythms that felt surprisingly natural. Zara woke each morning in a bedroom larger than her old apartment, dressed in clothes that actually fit properly thanks to Mrs. Park's insistence on appropriate wardrobe, and walked through gardens that made her feel like she was living inside a painting. The work was easier than any job she'd ever held, but also more meaningful. Mrs. Park wasn't just an employer, but was becoming family in the truest sense. Park Jae-sung remained largely absent during these first months, appearing only briefly for formal dinners or business calls that took him away for days at a time. When he was present, he watched from a careful distance, observing how his mother smiled more frequently, how she began wearing colors other than black, how she started asking for certain dishes that had been family favorites before grief had stolen her appetite. But it was during a crisis that Zara truly proved her worth and loyalty to the Park family. Park Jae-sung was in Busan on business when his mother collapsed in the garden during their afternoon walk. One moment Mrs. Park was pointing out new blooms on her favorite rose bush. The next she was clutching her chest and sinking to her knees while Mia screamed for her mother. Zara's response was immediate and decisive. She called the family's private medical team while simultaneously supporting Mrs. Park's weight and monitoring her breathing. She barked orders to the household staff in a mixture of English and broken Korean, demanding that someone contact Park Jae-sung while others prepared for the ambulance arrival. At Seoul Presbyterian Hospital, she refused to leave Mrs. Park's side despite multiple attempts by hospital staff to direct her to family waiting areas. When doctors tried to explain procedures in rapid Korean that Mrs. Park couldn't follow in her weakened state, Zara stepped in with the phrases the elderly woman had taught her, translating concerns and advocating for treatment decisions with a fierceness that surprised everyone present. Mrs. Park gripped her hand throughout the emergency procedures, speaking in whispered Korean that Zara translated for the medical team. She says the pain is lessening. She says to call her son and tell him she's not ready to join her husband yet. She says to thank you for staying with her. The diagnosis was exhaustion compounded by a mild cardiac episode brought on by stress and anxiety. Not life-threatening, but serious enough to require overnight observation and medication adjustments. Zara slept in the chair beside Mrs. Park's hospital bed, waking every hour to check on the elderly woman's comfort and communicate with nurses about pain management. Park Jae-sung arrived at dawn, having driven through the night from Busan. He found them as visiting hours began, his mother sleeping peacefully while Zara held her hand, both women looking exhausted but peaceful. The sight stopped him in the hospital room doorway, struck by something he couldn't immediately name. How is she? He asked quietly. Stable. The doctors say it was stress-related, but her heart is strong. She was more frightened than actually endangered, but they want to monitor her for 24 hours to be certain. And you've been here all night. Of course I have. She's family. The simple statement carried weight that resonated through everything he'd observed over the past 3 months. This wasn't duty or employment. This was genuine love and protective instinct that couldn't be bought or negotiated. Mrs. Park woke slowly, her eyes focusing first on Zara's concerned face, then shifting to her son's relieved expression. She spoke in Korean, her voice weak but clear, and Park Jae-sung's eyes widened at whatever she said. "What did she tell you?" Zara asked. He hesitated, then translated with careful precision. "She said you have the heart of a true daughter. She asked why I haven't married you yet, since you clearly love our family more than most blood relatives would." The translated words hung between them like a challenge and a revelation, changing the dynamic of their relationship in ways that none of them had anticipated, but all of them recognized as inevitable. Mrs. Park squeezed Zara's hand and spoke again, this time in English carefully chosen for maximum impact. "Good daughters are rare, Jae-sung. Ones who stay through the night are even rarer." Over the following weeks, as Mrs. Park recovered fully and their household routines resumed, Park Jae-sung began joining their family dinners more frequently. He would arrive in the early evening, still wearing his expensive suits, but with his controlled intensity relaxed into something approaching domesticity. He listened to his mother's stories, answered Mia's endless questions about Korean culture, and watched Zara navigate their family dynamics with grace that seemed effortless but was actually carefully cultivated. During these dinners, Zara began to see glimpses of the man beneath the crime boss facade. He was patient with his mother's repetitive stories about his father, gentle when Mia spilled soup on his expensive shirt, and surprisingly knowledgeable about literature when she mentioned the books she read to Mrs. Park during afternoon rest periods. But it was the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching that made Zara realize their carefully defined arrangement was evolving into something far more complicated and dangerous than either of them had planned. His dark eyes held appreciation that went beyond professional satisfaction, recognition that went beyond grateful employer, and possessiveness that went beyond protecting a valuable asset. 3 months after moving into the Park family compound, Zara Williams had successfully integrated into their world, proven her worth through crisis, and earned the genuine love of Mrs. Park. But she'd also begun falling for a man whose protection came with complications she was only beginning to understand, and whose interest in her was shifting from business necessity to personal obsession in ways that would soon test every boundary she'd tried to maintain. 5 months into their arrangement, Zara Williams had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated Park Jae-sung's mood and schedule, but she wasn't prepared for the evening when his carefully controlled facade finally cracked and revealed the wounded man beneath the criminal empire. The spring evening was unusually warm, with cherry blossoms drifting through the estate's gardens like snow. Mrs. Park had retired early after a full day of entertaining her elderly friends, leaving the main house quieter than usual. Mia was asleep in their apartment, exhausted from a day at Seoul International Academy, where she'd finally stopped asking when they were going home because this place had become home in every way that mattered. Zara was returning from her evening check on Mrs. Park when she found Park Jae-sung sitting alone in the garden pavilion, still wearing his expensive suit, but with his tie loosened and his usually perfect posture relaxed into something that looked almost vulnerable. A bottle of Korean whiskey sat on the low table beside him, along with 2 glasses, though only one showed signs of use. "You're working late," she said softly, not wanting to startle him. He looked up, his dark eyes focusing on her with less intensity than usual, and she realized he'd been drinking enough to dull the sharp edges of his control. "Not working. Thinking. About choices and consequences, and whether protecting the people you love sometimes requires becoming someone they shouldn't love." The philosophical observation was so unlike his usual direct communication that she found herself moving closer, drawn by curiosity and concern. "May I sit?" He gestured to the cushioned bench across from him, then poured whiskey into the second glass and slid it toward her. The golden liquid was smooth and expensive, warming her throat and settling in her stomach like liquid courage. "Mrs. Park had a good day," she said, searching for safe conversation. "She did. Thanks to you. She's become someone I barely recognized since you arrived. Happy. Engaged. She laughs at dinner now instead of just sitting politely while I report on business matters." The gratitude in his voice carried undercurrents that made her pulse quicken. She's easy to care for when you genuinely enjoy her company. And that's the difference, isn't it? You don't see her as a job or an obligation. You see her as family. Because she is family now. Park Jae-sung studied her face in the soft light from the garden lanterns, his expression shifting into something more personal than she'd seen before. Family is dangerous in my world, Zara. The more someone matters to you, the more vulnerable you become. The more you have to lose. Then why did you hire me to care for her? Because watching her fade away was worse than accepting the risk. He took another sip of whiskey, then set the glass down with careful precision. I had a sister once, younger than me by 4 years. Her name was Min Young, and she was everything good about our family before I turned it into something else. Sweet, kind, genuinely caring about everyone around her. She believed people were fundamentally decent until proven otherwise. The past tense and the pain in his voice told Zara where this story was heading, but she remained silent, recognizing that he needed to tell it completely. When I was building this empire, consolidating territory and establishing control, I was obsessed with power and respect and eliminating any threat to our family's position. I worked 18-hour days, traveled constantly, focused everything on making us untouchable. He paused, staring out at the gardens where security lights created pools of safety in the darkness. Minyoung met a man during that time. Kim Hyunwoo. He seemed perfect, educated, successful, respectful to our parents. He courted her properly, brought gifts, spoke about marriage and family. I approved of the relationship because he appeared to be exactly the kind of man she deserved. Zara's stomach tightened as she recognized the pattern. But he wasn't what he seemed. He was charming in public and brutal in private. It started with criticism about her appearance, her friends, her interests. Then isolation, cutting her off from family gatherings because he always had conflicts or emergencies that required her attention. Then control over her money, her schedule, her choices. The whiskey glass shook slightly in his hand as he continued. By the time the physical abuse started, she was already so isolated and convinced of her own worthlessness that she hid it from everyone. Long sleeves in summer, makeup to cover bruises, excuses for why she couldn't attend family dinners or celebrations. And you didn't notice. I was too busy building an empire to notice my sister was being destroyed right in front of me. Too focused on external threats to see the one that had moved into her apartment and was systematically breaking her spirit. The self-recrimination in his voice was so raw that Zara found herself leaning forward, wanting to offer comfort, but not knowing what words could possibly help. How did you find out? The hospital called me when she was brought in unconscious. Severe head trauma from what Kim Hyunwoo claimed was a fall down the stairs. But the injury patterns were wrong, and Minyoung had defensive wounds on her hands that told a different story. He stopped speaking for several moments, and Zara watched him struggle with memories that clearly still had the power to devastate him. She was in a coma for 3 days. When she woke up, the first thing she did was apologize to me. As if her suffering was somehow her fault, as if she was sorry for inconveniencing the family by nearly dying. What happened to him? Park Jae-sung's expression hardened into something cold and final. Kim Hyunwoo disappeared that night. Completely. No trace, no body, no investigation because no one reported him missing. People who hurt my family don't get second chances. But your sister survived. For 2 months. She moved back home, started therapy, seemed to be healing. But the damage was too extensive. She had seizures, memory problems, personality changes from the brain trauma. And the guilt nearly destroyed her. She blamed herself for not leaving sooner, for not telling us what was happening, for not being strong enough to fight back. The final piece of the story settled over them like a shroud. She took her own life on a Tuesday morning while I was in a business meeting that seemed too important to reschedule. Left a letter saying she was tired of being broken, tired of being afraid, tired of feeling like a burden to everyone who loved her. Zara felt tears burning behind her eyes for a woman she'd never met, for the pain that had shaped the man sitting across from her, for the guilt that had turned his protective instincts into an obsession. I'm sorry. I can't imagine losing someone that way. The worst part wasn't losing her. The worst part was realizing I'd failed completely as her protector. I had all this power, all these resources, all this capacity for violence, and I couldn't save the person who mattered most because I was too busy using those tools for everything except what actually mattered. He looked directly at her, his dark eyes intense despite the alcohol softening his usual sharp edges. That's why I can't ignore women in danger, Zara. Why I notice bruises and fear and desperation even when people try to hide them. Why I recognized what you were running from the moment you slapped me for making assumptions about your character. The connection between his sister's story and her own situation created a bridge of understanding that changed everything between them. Is that why you really hired me? Because I reminded you of her. Partly. But mostly because you showed the kind of strength she never had the chance to develop. You fought back. You protected your daughter. You didn't let circumstances break your spirit even when they broke nearly everything else. Zara set down her whiskey glass and looked at this powerful, dangerous man who was revealing wounds that probably no one else had ever seen. I wasn't always strong, Jae-sung. Marcus, Mia's father, he didn't hit me, but he destroyed my confidence in other ways. Gambling away our savings, lying about debts, disappearing for days without explanation, making me feel like I was somehow responsible for his failures, like I wasn't supportive enough or understanding enough or attractive enough to keep him happy. Park Jae-sung's expression shifted into something protective and angry. When did you realize it wasn't your fault? When I found out about the gambling debts he'd hidden from me. $50,000 owed to people who made it clear they'd collect one way or another. I had a choice. Stay and watch my daughter grow up in that chaos, or leave and build something better for both of us. What did you choose? I emptied our bank account, packed 2 suitcases, and moved to Seoul with a 4-year-old who didn't understand why Daddy wasn't coming with us. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, but also the moment I started becoming the person Mia needed me to be. And now I'm sitting in a garden that costs more than most people's houses, talking to a man whose protection means more safety than I ever thought possible, and wondering how I got so lucky. The words hung between them like a confession, and Zara realized she'd revealed more about her feelings than she'd intended. Park Jae-sung leaned forward, his gaze intense and searching. Lucky isn't the word I'd use, he said quietly. You earned this, Zara. Through your courage, your kindness to my mother, your dedication to your daughter. Through being exactly the kind of person who deserves protection and care and happiness. The space between them seemed to shrink, and she found herself studying his face in the lantern light, noticing details she'd tried to ignore during months of careful professional distance. The way his eyes softened when he looked at her. The controlled strength in his hands. The mouth that could command empires, but spoke so gently to his mother and daughter. We should go inside, she said, though she made no move to stand. Should we? The question carried implications that made her pulse quicken. Because sitting here in the intimate darkness, sharing stories that neither of them had probably told anyone else, felt like crossing a line they'd both been carefully avoiding. Before she could answer, his phone buzzed with an incoming message that made his entire demeanor shift from vulnerable to dangerous in the space of a heartbeat. What is it? She asked, recognizing the change immediately. He read the message twice, his expression growing colder with each word. We need to go inside. Now. The urgency in his voice cut through the intimate atmosphere like a knife. As they walked quickly toward the main house, he made several phone calls in rapid Korean that she couldn't follow but understood were mobilizing security. Once inside, he guided her to his private office and activated security systems that turned the windows opaque and engaged locks she hadn't known existed. Jae-sung, you're frightening me. I'm sorry, but there's been a development that affects you and Mia directly. He showed her his phone screen, and though the Korean text was incomprehensible to her, the attached photographs were crystal clear. Pictures of her walking Mia to school, of them shopping in Seoul's markets, of her sitting with Mrs. Park in the garden. Surveillance photos that had been taken without her knowledge over several weeks. Who took these? The Nakamura family. They're a Yakuza organization that's been trying to expand their territory into areas I control. They've been looking for leverage to use against me. And apparently they've decided that my family's happiness represents a weakness they can exploit. The casual mention of Yakuza made her stomach clench with fear. What do they want? To prove that I can't protect what matters to me. That my power has limits. That caring about people makes me vulnerable to pressure. And Mia and I are what matters to you. The question slipped out before she could stop it, and his answer came without hesitation. Yes, you are. The simple confession carried weight that changed everything between them. But before she could process the implications, he continued with information that made personal feelings seem secondary to immediate survival. They're not going to attack directly. That would be too obvious and would violate agreements that keep Seoul from becoming a war zone. Instead, they'll create situations designed to prove their point. Accidents that aren't accidents. Dangers that I can't prevent because I can't be everywhere at once. What kind of situations? Car trouble on isolated roads. Food poisoning from restaurants we frequent. Incidents at Mia's school that could be explained as coincidences, but aren't. They want to demonstrate that my protection has limits. The methodical nature of the threat was somehow more terrifying than direct violence. What do? We have options. I can arrange for you and Mia to relocate somewhere safe with enough money to start over. New identities, new lives, complete separation from anything connected to me or my family. He paused, and she heard the reluctance in his voice. Or you stay, and we face this together. But that means accepting that you're no longer just employees or guests. You become family in every sense, with all the protection and danger that entails. The choice he was offering felt like the most important decision of her life. Safety through separation, or security through belonging to something larger and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. If we stay, what happens to them? The Nakamura family. They learned that threatening my family was the worst mistake they could have made. The cold certainty in his voice reminded her exactly who she was dealing with. But instead of frightening her, it created a sense of safety that went beyond rational thought. How much time do I have to decide? Until morning. But Zara, yes, whatever you choose, know that these past months have meant more to me and my mother than I know how to express. You've given us something I thought we'd lost forever. What's that? A reason to come home every night. The vulnerability in his confession, combined with the immediate danger and the choice between safety and belonging, created a perfect storm of emotion and need that made her next words feel inevitable. I don't need until morning, she said quietly. We're staying. Are you certain? I've been running from dangerous men my whole life. Jae-sung, I'm tired of running. If you say you can protect us, I believe you. The relief in his expression was so profound that she realized he'd been preparing himself for the possibility that she might choose safety over whatever was growing between them. Then you should know that as of this moment, you and Mia are under my complete protection, which means anyone who threatens you will have to go through me first. The possessive promise in his voice made her pulse quicken with something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the dangerous attraction that had been building between them for months. And what does that make us to you? She asked. Mine, he said simply. My family. My responsibility. My future. The claiming in his voice was absolute and final, and as Zara looked into his dark eyes, she realized that accepting his protection meant accepting something far more complicated and permanent than either of them had planned. But for the first time in years, she felt completely safe, completely valued, and completely ready to fight for the life they were building together. The Nakamura family's first move came exactly 1 week after the surveillance photos arrived, and it targeted the one person whose safety mattered more to Zara than her own life. The call came at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon while Zara was helping Mrs. Park arrange fresh orchids in the main house conservatory. Park Jae-sung's voice was controlled but urgent when he spoke into his secure phone, switching between Korean and English so rapidly that she could only catch fragments of the conversation. School. Mia. Immediate extraction. Enhanced security protocol. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. What's happening? She asked the moment he ended the call. 3 men attempted to pick up Mia from Seoul International Academy, claiming to be family friends sent because of a medical emergency. The school followed proper procedures and refused release without proper authorization, but the men became aggressive before disappearing when security arrived. The careful calm in his explanation did nothing to mask the deadly fury building behind his dark eyes. Is she safe? She's safe. My security team collected her the moment the school called, and she's being brought here now with full protection detail. But this was a direct challenge, Zara. They're not testing anymore. Park Jae-sung moved to his office windows, activating security systems that turned the compound into an impenetrable fortress. Armed guards appeared at positions she'd never noticed before, and the peaceful gardens suddenly felt like a military installation preparing for siege. The black sedan that brought Mia home was flanked by 2 additional vehicles, and when her daughter ran into her arms, Zara held her with desperate relief that made her hands shake. "Mama, why were there so many cars?" Mia asked, her 4-year-old voice filled with confusion rather than fear. "Just extra protection, sweetheart. Like having lots of bodyguards to make sure you're always safe." Mrs. Park appeared in the hallway, moving faster than Zara had seen since the elderly woman's hospital stay. Without hesitation, she gathered both Zara and Mia into an embrace that spoke of shared understanding about the seriousness of what had just occurred. Over the next 3 days, the compound operated under complete lockdown. No one entered or left without authorization from Park Jae-sung personally. Private tutors were brought in for Mia's continued education, medical staff remained on-site for Mrs. Park's care, and household functions continued with seamless efficiency despite the underlying tension that permeated every interaction. But it was Park Jae-sung's transformation that showed Zara exactly who she'd fallen in love with and what that love would cost. The man who joined family dinners and listened to his mother's stories disappeared entirely, replaced by someone cold and methodical and absolutely terrifying in his controlled precision. He worked 18-hour days from his secure office, coordinating operations through encrypted communications with an efficiency that spoke of years of experience managing exactly this kind of crisis. She watched him through the soundproof glass of his office, noting how his entire posture changed when he was giving orders that she suspected involved violence and permanent solutions. His expensive suits remained impeccable, but his eyes became flat and emotionless, and when he looked at her during their brief interactions, she could see the effort it required for him to shift back into someone capable of tenderness. On the second night of lockdown, she found him in his office at 2 in the morning, surrounded by surveillance photographs and tactical maps that painted a picture of systematic warfare being conducted beyond the compound walls. "You should be sleeping," he said without looking up from documents covered in Korean text and red markings that probably indicated targets. "So should you. Sleep is a luxury I can't afford until this is finished." She moved closer, studying his profile in the harsh light from multiple monitors that showed security feeds from around Seoul. "How long will it take to finish?" "As long as necessary." The Nakamura family made a fundamental miscalculation when they threatened Mia. They thought my caring about you was a weakness they could exploit. They're discovering it's actually the most dangerous aspect of my personality. The casual menace in his voice should have frightened her, but instead it created a sense of safety that went beyond rational thought. "What happens when it's over?" "When it's over, no one will ever threaten my family again, because the consequences will be too severe for anyone to risk." He looked at her then, and she saw exhaustion and determination and something that looked like fear. "Are you afraid of what I'm becoming, Zara? Of what you're seeing me do to protect you?" She considered the question carefully, studying the man who'd shown her more kindness and protection than anyone in her adult life, who'd given her daughter opportunities and safety she'd never imagined possible, who'd made his elderly mother happy in ways that went beyond professional duty. "I'm afraid of losing what we have," she said finally, "but not of who you are when you're protecting it." The relief in his expression lasted only a moment before duty called him back to the systematic destruction of everyone who'd threatened his family. On the 3rd day, the compound fell silent in a way that felt final rather than temporary. Park Jae-sung's communications ceased. His security teams reported status updates in tones that suggested completion rather than progress, and the tension that had hummed through every interaction began dissipating like smoke. He appeared in the main house at sunset, still wearing the expensive suit that had become his uniform during the crisis, but something fundamental had changed. The cold precision was gone, replaced by exhaustion and relief, and an emotional vulnerability that made him look younger than his 35 years. "Is it finished?" Zara asked, though she already knew the answer from the way his shoulders had relaxed. "It's finished. The Nakamura family no longer exists as an operational entity. Their leadership has been permanently removed, their territories redistributed, their remaining members absorbed into organizations that understand the importance of respecting boundaries." The clinical language couldn't disguise what had actually occurred, but Zara found herself accepting the necessity without moral conflict. These people had threatened her daughter. Park Jae-sung had eliminated that threat completely. The mathematics of survival in his world were that simple and that final. And their threat to Mia will never be repeated by anyone else. The message has been sent clearly enough that future challenges will focus on business disputes rather than personal vulnerabilities. Mrs. Park appeared in the doorway, took one look at her son's exhausted state, and began giving orders in rapid Korean that resulted in hot tea appearing within minutes and dinner being prepared despite the late hour. During the quiet family meal that followed, Zara watched Park Jae-sung interact with his mother and daughter with a gentleness that seemed impossible given what she knew he'd spent 3 days accomplishing. He answered Mia's questions about why they couldn't leave the house, listened to Mrs. Park's concerns about missed medical appointments, and gradually relaxed into the domestic routine that had become their family's foundation. But it was after dinner, when Mrs. Park had retired and Mia was asleep, that the emotional barriers he'd maintained during the crisis finally cracked completely. They were alone in the garden pavilion where they'd shared whiskey and vulnerability just days earlier, but everything between them had changed in ways that made careful professional distance impossible. "I was terrified," he said quietly, the admission surprising them both. "Terrified of what?" "Of losing you. Both of you. Of failing to protect what matters most to me the same way I failed Minyoung. Of having to live with the knowledge that my enemies could touch my family despite all my power and resources." The raw honesty in his voice cut through every careful boundary she tried to maintain between employer and something deeper. "But you didn't fail. We're safe. Mia is safe. Your mother is safe. This time. But there will always be threats, always people who see my family as weakness to exploit, always reasons to worry that my protection isn't enough." She moved closer to him on the bench, drawn by need and gratitude and feelings that had been building for months despite her attempts to deny them. "Then we faced them together," she said simply. He turned toward her, his dark eyes intense and searching in the soft lantern light. "Together means you're accepting everything that comes with being part of my world, Zara. The danger, the violence, the moral compromises, the isolation from people who could never understand our choices. I accepted all of that when I decided to stay. What I'm accepting now is you. All of you." The space between them disappeared as he reached for her, his hands framing her face with desperate tenderness that spoke of relief and need and recognition that they'd crossed a line neither of them wanted to uncross. When he kissed her, it was with months of restrained desire finally given permission, with gratitude for survival and safety, with possession and promise that went far beyond any contract they'd ever signed. She responded with equal intensity, her hands gripping his shoulders as she poured every complicated emotion of the past week into physical connection that felt like coming home and jumping off a cliff simultaneously. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily and trembling with emotion, his next words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You're mine now, Zara. You and Mia. My family, my responsibility, my future. I'll never let anything happen to either of you again." The possessive declaration should have triggered her independence instincts, should have reminded her of every controlling relationship she'd escaped. Instead, it felt like safety and belonging and love expressed in language that honored the dangerous reality of their world. "And you're ours," she replied, her voice steady despite the enormity of what they were claiming. "All of yours, Jae-sung. The broken pieces and the beautiful ones. The man who reads bedtime stories and the one who eliminates threats. We choose all of it." The acceptance in her voice, the recognition that she understood exactly who he was and loved him anyway, broke through the last of his emotional control. He pulled her closer, holding her with desperate relief that spoke of fears he'd never admitted and needs he'd never allowed himself to acknowledge. "I love you," he said against her hair, the words carrying surprise as if he hadn't expected to feel something so ordinary and extraordinary in a life defined by power and danger. "I love you too," she replied, and meant it in ways that encompassed protection and possession, tenderness and violence, domestic peace and eternal vigilance. They sat together in the garden where they'd first shared vulnerability, now bound by something deeper than contracts or arrangements or even mutual benefit. They were family in the truest sense, forged through crisis and choice and love that was strong enough to survive in a world where weakness meant death and caring meant becoming a target. The Park family compound had become their fortress, their sanctuary, their home in ways that went beyond geography or architecture. And as the Seoul night settled around them, Zara Williams realized she'd found something she'd never thought possible. A man whose protection was absolute, whose love was fierce enough to eliminate threats, and whose dangerous world had become the safest place she'd ever known. 3 weeks after the Nakamura threat was permanently eliminated, Zara Williams woke in Park Jae-sung's arms as morning sunlight filtered through the master bedroom's floor-to-ceiling windows and realized that safety had become something she no longer questioned but simply breathed like air. The past weeks had established new rhythms that felt both natural and miraculous. Park Jae-sung had moved them into the main house's family wing, creating a domestic arrangement that honored both tradition and their unconventional beginning. Their mornings began with family breakfast in the conservatory, where Mrs. Park presided over conversations that mixed Korean and English with the easy fluency of people who'd learned to bridge cultures through love rather than obligation. Mia had adapted to their changed circumstances with the resilience of childhood, accepting that Jae-sung was now part of their family structure with the same matter-of-fact acceptance she'd shown for everything else about their new life. She called him Uncle Jae-sung in English and something that sounded like father in Korean, depending on her mood and the audience, and he responded to both with patience that would have surprised anyone who knew only his business reputation. But it was Mrs. Park's transformation that provided the strongest evidence of how completely their family had evolved beyond its original arrangement. The elderly woman had regained not only her health and happiness, but her sense of purpose as family matriarch. She planned menus that honored both Korean traditions and Zara's preferences, taught Mia cultural customs while learning about American holidays, and watched her son's growing contentment with satisfaction that spoke of long-held hopes finally fulfilled. On this particular morning, Park Jae-sung was already awake when Zara stirred, his dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that had become familiar over their weeks of shared intimacy. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her voice still soft with sleep. "The future. Our future. How to make it official in ways that honor both your independence and my need to protect what's mine." The possessive language that had once made her wary now created warmth that had nothing to do with the heated floors beneath their bed. "What did you have in mind?" He reached for something on the nightstand, and when he turned back toward her, he was holding a small black velvet box that made her pulse quicken with anticipation and surprise. "I have something that belongs to you," he said, opening the box to reveal a ring that took her breath away. The engagement ring was a masterpiece of understated elegance, featuring a perfect diamond surrounded by smaller stones in a setting that managed to be both contemporary and timeless. But it was the significance rather than the beauty that made her throat tighten with emotion. "This was my grandmother's ring," he said quietly. "My mother wore it for 45 years of marriage to my father. It's been waiting for the right woman to carry our family forward." The weight of tradition and acceptance in the gesture overwhelmed her more than any expensive jewelry could have. "Jae-sung, marry me, Zara. Not because of contracts or arrangements or practical considerations, but because I can't imagine a future that doesn't include waking up beside you every morning for the rest of my life." The proposal was simple and direct, without elaborate planning or performance, and it felt perfect for the relationship they'd built through crisis and choice rather than romance and courtship. "Yes," she whispered, extending her hand so he could slide the ring onto her finger where it settled with the rightness of destiny. The diamond caught the morning light and threw rainbows across the ceiling, but she was more focused on the relief and joy in Park Jae-sung's expression as he leaned forward to seal their engagement with a kiss that promised everything they'd found together and everything they were choosing to build. Their official engagement lasted exactly long enough for them to dress and make their way to the conservatory for breakfast, where Mrs. Park took one look at the ring on Zara's finger and began crying tears of happiness while speaking rapid Korean that clearly included prayers of gratitude and plans for celebration. Mia's reaction was more direct and equally touching. "Does this mean Jae-sung is going to be my daddy?" she asked with 4-year-old practicality. "If that's what you want, sweetheart," Zara replied carefully. Mia considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, looking between the 3 adults who were watching her with varying degrees of anxiety. "I want that," she announced. But he has to promise to teach me more Korean words and take me to get ice cream sometimes. I promise, Park Jae-sung said solemnly, and Zara realized she was watching him fall in love with the idea of fatherhood in real time. The wedding planning that followed reflected their unique circumstances and blended heritage. Mrs. Park insisted on traditional Korean elements while ensuring that Zara's family and culture were equally honored. They scheduled the ceremony for 6 weeks later, allowing time for Zara's mother to travel from Atlanta and for the extensive security arrangements required for any public gathering of the Park family. But it was the legal formalities that truly transformed their situation from romantic commitment to permanent family unit. Park Jae-sung arranged for Mia's adoption with efficiency that spoke of preparation and certainty, ensuring that her daughter would carry the Park family name and inheritance rights regardless of what might happen to either parent in their dangerous world. The adoption ceremony at Seoul Family Court was small and private, witnessed only by Mrs. Park and the attorney who'd drawn up documents that made Mia legally and completely their daughter. When the judge pronounced them a family, Mia insisted on calling Park Jae-sung Appa for the first time, and Zara watched this powerful, dangerous man struggle with emotions that had nothing to do with business or territory or control. "You're sure about this?" she asked him later that evening as they reviewed the completed paperwork that made their family official in the eyes of Korean law. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life," he replied. "She's already my daughter in every way that matters. Now she's legally protected in ways that go beyond my personal guarantee." The practical aspects of their union reflected his systematic approach to protecting what mattered most to him. Trust funds were established to ensure Mia's education through university regardless of circumstance. Medical care was guaranteed through private physicians and international treatment networks. Safe houses were prepared in multiple countries should relocation ever become necessary. But it was the emotional security that mattered most to Zara as she watched their family dynamic evolve from arrangement to genuine love. Park Jae-sung's business operations began shifting toward more legitimate enterprises, not from moral conversion, but from practical recognition that his family's happiness required stability that went beyond violence and intimidation. The wedding itself took place in the compound's gardens under cherry blossoms that Mrs. Park insisted represented new beginnings and eternal love. Zara wore a dress that honored both American traditions and Korean aesthetics, while Park Jae-sung appeared in traditional Korean formal, where that emphasized his cultural heritage while acknowledging the international nature of their union. Mrs. Park served as officiant through a Korean elder she'd known for decades, conducting a ceremony that blended languages and customs with the easy grace of people who understood that love transcended cultural boundaries. Mia served as both flower girl and ring bearer, taking her responsibilities seriously while occasionally forgetting to walk slowly down the garden paths. The vows they exchanged were written personally, reflecting their unique journey from employer and employee to protector and protected to partners, choosing to face whatever came next together. "I promise to love you through whatever dangers our world presents," Park Jae-sung said, his voice carrying to the small gathering of family and trusted associates. "To protect you and Mia not from obligation, but from devotion. To build a life worthy of the trust you've placed in me. I promise to love all of you," Zara replied, her voice steady despite the emotion tightening her throat. "The man who reads bedtime stories and the one who eliminates threats. To stand beside you as we create a family strong enough to survive anything." When they were pronounced husband and wife, the kiss they shared felt like the culmination of everything they'd survived and the beginning of everything they'd chosen to build together. The reception that followed was elegant but intimate, limited to people who understood the delicate balance between celebration and security that defined their world. Mrs. Park gave a speech in Korean that reduced several guests to tears before switching to English for Zara's benefit. "Today my son brings home not just a wife, but a true daughter and granddaughter who have made our house a home again," she said, her voice carrying across the garden pavilion where they'd first shared vulnerability and whiskey. "Love is rare in our world. When it appears, we protect it with everything we have." As evening settled over the compound, Zara found herself standing with Park Jae-sung on the terrace overlooking gardens that had become the setting for every important moment in their relationship. Mia was asleep in the main house, exhausted from a day of being the center of attention, while Mrs. Park held court with elderly friends who traveled from across Seoul to witness the wedding. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, leaning against his side as they watched security teams maintaining their invisible perimeter. "Regret what?" "Slapping a dangerous man in an expensive hotel and starting all of this." He was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "I regret that it took a slap to make me notice the most remarkable woman I'd ever met," he said finally. "I regret the months we spent pretending this was purely professional. I regret every moment of your life before this when you weren't safe and protected the way you deserved to be. And the rest of it. The danger, the complexity, the fact that our love story sounds like something from a Korean drama. The rest of it is exactly what I want for the next 50 years, Mrs. Park Zara Williams." The sound of her new name, spoken with possessive satisfaction and infinite tenderness, created a sense of belonging that went beyond marriage certificates or adoption papers or trust funds. She thought about the woman who'd cleaned hotel rooms while calculating whether she could afford both groceries and her daughter's medication. About the desperate mathematics of survival that had defined every choice for years. About the moment when poverty and fear had been replaced by security and love through one impulsive act of self-defense. "I love you, Park Jae-sung," she said against his shoulder, breathing in the expensive cologne that had become as familiar as safety itself. "And I love you, Park Zara," he replied, the possessive certainty in his voice carrying promises that would last lifetimes. Their wedding night was spent in the master bedroom that had become their sanctuary, making love with passion that spoke of gratitude and possession and commitment that went far beyond legal documents. But it was the morning after, waking up as husband and wife while their daughter's laughter echoed through the house, and Mrs. Park hummed Korean folk songs in the conservatory, that felt like the true beginning of their forever. 6 months after their wedding, as autumn painted the compound gardens in shades of gold and red, Zara Williams Park realized that her life had become something she'd never dared dream possible. Mia thrived in international school while speaking Korean with increasing fluency. Mrs. Park had become the grandmother every child deserved, wise and loving and endlessly patient. Park Jae-sung had evolved from dangerous protector to devoted husband and father, though he retained enough of his controlled intensity to ensure that their family remained absolutely safe in an uncertain world. She was no longer the exhausted single mother who'd cleaned penthouses while counting medications and calculating impossible rent payments. She was the wife of one of Seoul's most powerful men, the daughter-in-law of a woman who'd accepted her completely, the mother of a thriving child who knew she was loved and protected beyond measure. But more than any of that, she was home in ways that had nothing to do with marble countertops or private schools or trust funds. Home in the arms of a man who'd proven that love could be both tender and fierce, that protection could become devotion, that choosing to trust someone dangerous could lead to the safest place she'd ever known. As evening settled over the compound and Seoul's lights began twinkling beyond the garden walls that protected rather than imprisoned, Zara stood in the master bedroom, watching her husband sleep peacefully beside their daughter, who'd climbed into their bed after a nightmare, and stayed, because she felt safest between the two people who loved her most in the world. Park Zara Williams had found her forever, and it was more beautiful and complicated and perfect than any fairy tale she'd ever imagined.